Now excited to be joined by a very special guest. It is the Athletics' Scott Dochterman. Scott, I've got a lot that I want to get to with you, but first, got to talk about someone who was a household name at Iowa, but is no longer there. Someone who was talked about in a way that I'm not sure we've seen at the college level in recent memory. You saw all of this unfold. Scott, how excited do we get to be as Bears fans now that Tory Taylor is coming to Chicago?
Oh, awesome! I was wondering where you're going to go with this, but I think he's the right guy, and even in the right round. I know there was a lot of people saying fourth round for a punter. That's really rich, but I'll tell you this: after watching Iowa's offense all these years, he was as instrumental in four major victories as any player on the field. I go back to when they were in the top 10 and then in the top 5. And they won a game against Penn State. It was a 3-4 game. And they won a 9-10 game against Iowa State. And he was unreal because he was able to park the ball and then it scooted out of bounds at the 3-yard line. And then, the opponent, Penn State, of course, had a backup quarterback in that game and couldn't do anything. The notorious 7-3 win against South Dakota State where they had two safeties. He parked both punts inside the 10-yard line, one at the 1. And that helped Iowa win. And then this year against Wisconsin. So he's punted in all kinds of crazy weather, as you can imagine, bad wind, cold, extreme cold in Minnesota, below zero, snow, whatever. So that won't phase him with the wind off the lake. So I think overall he's going to be a real asset. And I always looked at him as he gave Iowa's defense a first down because of the way he kicked. And when you're looking at, punting, and instead of the team getting the ball at the 27, they're getting it at the 13 or the 12. That's an extra first down the offense has to go through. And then, and Iowa's defense was good enough to capitalize on it. And I think the Bears are heading in that direction. So, yes, I think it's a big move for the Bears.
One of my best buddies and he went to Iowa and he's a Bears fan. And the day that he was drafted, he texted like in our group chat, the custom jersey that he ordered, like literally that day. Iowa and Bears fans love punting maybe as much as human beings love anything. So it just kind of felt right. That kind of tells you all you need to know, though. Like, as somebody that's probably watched just so many punts. I don't know if there's a player with a higher approval rating in all of college football than Tory Taylor.
Yeah, for sure. And his personality matches. He's from Australia. When he came here, he had to quarantine twice, once in Australia and then once when he got to Iowa City because it was during COVID. His first game he ever saw for college football was in an empty stadium in Purdue, and he really struggled with some of the rules. There was one time there was a punt, and it hit the ground, and it was in the snow, and he just decided, I'm going to kick it on the ground. And of course that was illegal, but he started to learn, and but he's got a great personality. He's really fun. He's not your typical, special teams guy that people kind of get on. And he got the loudest applause on senior day, just because, now granted, a lot of that's because the offense was so terrible that they had to find something to cheer for. And he was the great one, but like I said, he was so good. And last year he set the record for the most punting yards in a season that was set in 1938 when they would punt on first and second down. So just a remarkable career he had, and I think he'll do great things with the Bears.
I thought about it like Caitlin Clark, Tory Taylor, and Brian Ferentz's replacement walk into Brothers in Iowa City. Who gets the loudest uproar?
Wow. That's a great question. I would probably go with Caitlin just a little bit more, but she would kind of try to sneak in the back door.
Yeah.
Tory Taylor would walk in, they're playing Disco Inferno.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I know you're sick of talking about him, but from your vantage point, what did you make of this entire Brian Ferentz thing and the way that this situation played out? Because to me, the second that it became public that there was this drive to 325, it was over. Like, it was done from there. There was no way he was going to be able to succeed there. And it was just a punching bag matter of time from that point. But what did you take from watching all this play out?
I thought that if I were him, and I had a couple of ADs in the Big Ten tell me this, they're like, why didn't he resign a couple of years ago? He knew where this was going. It was putting a lot of pressure on his dad. It was, and he's a really smart football guy. That is true. But once the drive for 325 came about, and the critical mass had left him a while ago, they weren't going to listen to any reasons, and there were some that were legitimate, but they were done. And when the drive for 325, which I thought was really a foolish thought by the athletic director at the time, Gary Barta, because then it became a laughing stock, and it happened after signing day. So, I'm talking to podcasts at the Athletic and all across the country, radio shows going, all right, so tell me about this. And Brian Ferentz, there were graphics and everything. So they set him up to fail. And then when they had really unprecedented injuries at quarterback, at tight end, both tight ends were NFL guys. Both were out for the season, wide receiver issues, offensive line issues. And that's when it all just kind of went kaput. And luckily for Iowa, they had the right AD in place, and they do now, and Beth Getz. And she realized that right around the bye week, he's going to finish out the season, but we're not going to renew his contract. He's done. Kirk hated it because he likes to wait till the end of the year, but that was too long. The fans were just done. And I think it diffused everything here. Even though the offense was still the same bad offense for the last month, it wasn't like this anger and uproar. It was like, okay, this is going to be over soon. We'll just get through it. And then they ended up winning the division, and I know it was a bad division, and I know the teams weren't very good that they played, but somebody had to win those games. And they're winning those games with an average of 15 points, which shows you how good the defense was that led the country in yards per play allowed and had 200 more snaps than number 2, which was Penn State. So that's just pretty remarkable. But, with Brian, it was, I think Peter Principle is the way we want to look at this now. Outstanding offensive line coach, not as good of a play caller. And certainly when he got moved to quarterback coach, that was a really foolish move, I thought.
In many ways, it felt like watching Iowa was a step back in time. And then this Kadyn Proctor situation is like a glimpse into the future, or at least what people fear the future can be. What happened really with all of this? Because I don't think the craziest thing is that a kid went back and forth between a couple of schools. He did the boomerang transfer, as Philip Dukes would call it. It's that Iowa self-imposed a tampering violation for having contact with him his freshman year at Alabama. You've been breaking news at every point during the, throughout this entire story, this saga, whatever you want to call it. Take us through kind of the timeline and why this played out the way that it did.
There was always this hope from Iowa people, from not only people who knew him, but people inside the program that Kadyn Proctor would come back, because they had a great relationship with him throughout his recruitment. He'd been on campus more than 30 times as an unofficial visitor, going all the way back to his 8th grade year. So he started to wane late after he committed in June, the same day USC and UCLA committed to the Big Ten. So that made for a challenging day for me. But then he started to wane. The offense wasn't very good. And then I think he saw stars, and he gets, I would say he's kind of a follower, and that's maybe his personality. And he's like, well, I want to go to Oregon. So he went to Oregon and didn't tell anybody, and that kind of caused an uproar. And then he went to Alabama again on an unofficial, and then flipped like 2 days before. And in talking to Iowa staff, and of course you can chide them on this, but you can understand too, is they're like, we weren't even really looking in the portal because we didn't want to push him away. We wanted to show him, look, you're our guy. We've got you. You're going to start as a freshman here. So we're not even going to entertain other guys. So they let a week or so in the portal go by, and then he flips, and then they're like, oh, crap. And then they grabbed a D2 guy that didn't play. That's what ended up happening. Well, the self-imposed violation was caused after he really struggled against Texas. And that was a bad day. And then I think it was Mike Farrell, well known in the industry, that sent out something on Twitter just to say, hey, all these Iowa fans are probably excited to see him struggle. And then Tyler Barnes was like, no, we're rooting for him. We like him, because they did develop a really good relationship with him. It hurt them, wounded them. In fact, they're like, we got to impose a 24-hour rule on us for these types of recruiting losses. And then he sent him just kind of a text, and it was really a innocuous text like, hey, keep your head up. We got, you're going to be great. Don't worry about it. And so that he thought of that as being some sort of a really nice gesture by Iowa. And it wasn't, there wasn't anything, hey, keep us in mind, or, which, they could have done. Well, when Nick Saban retired Kadyn realized he had options, and then he's looking around and, oh, well, I want to go back to Iowa. And then there was kind of this crowdsourcing by the collective here, which does pretty well, but can always do better, as anybody knows, of, hey, we know what's out there. And then they raised, like, within several hours, like $120,000 or something like that, which wasn't bad because it was all grassroots. Kadyn committed within a couple of days. He was on campus. He talked about it. This feels like home. This is home. Wearing an Iowa shirt at a basketball game. But as the winter conditioning period kind of took off, in some ways he wasn't really together, connected, I would say, with a lot of his teammates. There were a few. I mean, Xavier Wampa, who's a fellow 5-star, who's a safety for Iowa, and everybody will know who he is this year, was his high school teammate and really wanted him there. But even then, there was a disconnect, I would say, between Iowa, whether it was a lot of the offensive linemen, some of the staff, and then he spring break came up, and he decided to go on spring break with some of his former Alabama teammates. And at that point, just kind of went, oh, this is where I want to go. And the next week, first day of it was the same week spring football started. He didn't show up to weightlifting. I think it was on Tuesday morning. He didn't even show up, and they're like knocking, calling him, texting him, sent somebody over just to see, and they couldn't get in. Nobody could reach him, and so then they got worried, like, oh my God, what happened? Something happened. So they had somebody kind of go in, and he was in there, and then at the time, and decided, I'm done. I want to go somewhere else. I want to go back to Alabama. And they're like, what? They wand floored by this. And then there were some things that came out later. He said he was, they do a lot of videos of, weightlifting and stuff. And there wasn't any of him in it. And he thought that, he should have been. And I'm like, yeah, that you were here like 6 weeks. That's spring practice is starting this week. You don't think you're going to get some serious attention now? I mean, so that was a little wild. And he ended up deciding he wanted to leave. And the only real problem from the NIL perspective, which I know fans were just like, I gave $10,000 to this. I gave, $500 to this because I wanted, left tackle, and turned out it was a business. It was like a legacy business. They've been in the Iowa game for a long time, 5-6 decades, and they're the ones that got hurt out of it. And but still, it was really tough for them to swallow. And I think when you start to look at the big picture, Connor, it's like this is the type of rules and type of situation that everybody wants to avoid. And in his case, I think it's fair to question his maturity. Maybe it's when Nick Saban retires, it's okay. Why don't you stay there through the semester and see how you feel in May? Maybe it's better for you to give the next coach a chance, and then if you feel differently at the end of May, you want to come back home, then go ahead and come back home. Or the other way is, okay, you're leaving there. You really need to give Iowa a chance. And at the end of the semester, if you're homesick for your friends or you feel like you made a mistake or a rash decision, then in May, make that call, not halfway through and then kind of, burn your bridges on the way out, because now it's, that's never, it's never going to happen here for him. And I don't mean just college, but in 10 years or 15 years, when his NFL career is over with, he can't come back to Iowa and be some sort of hey, we got a radio show with Kadyn Proctor and stuff. I mean, people are going to be like, I don't even want to hear about it. And that's really unfortunate for him in the big picture.
Yeah, it's Ben with the accounting firm from Parks and Rec. That's the example I use in situations like this of just like, nope, not going to happen. Looks like it's going to happen again. Oh, nope, no, actually not going to happen. It's wild. And it's one of those unfortunate realities of this situation, because you could look at it from the Iowa perspective and say, all right, well, yeah, I mean, they reached out to a kid that they obviously already had a relationship with. And then, the tampering thing ends up happening. And he goes on spring break with his friends from Bama. And you mean to tell me that that's not considered tampering? And that's why it's tampering itself is just such a silly premise that the NCAA thinks it can actually enforce. Mm-hmm. And it's just that's when I side with coaches when they say this is truly the Wild West, because there's just nothing stopping Bama from doing what it did. And every team wishes that they could have that type of pull. Did you get the sense that Bama significantly sweetened the deal for him to be able to come back?
No, because Iowa had always had a pretty good deal for him. I
Right.
mean, even in high school, he had a car that got taken away after he flipped. But there was a major car dealership in Des Moines area that provided that for him. So I don't see, I don't see anything of major use there or problem there. I just think that it's somebody that kind of mentally went back and forth and maybe felt like he made a mistake, and then he decided he didn't and wanted to go back, and it was indecision. It was I would say immaturity, and ultimately I think that might have been the problem there. I don't think Alabama really sweetened the deal on this. I think this was just kind of indecision by somebody who maybe needed a little bit more guidance. Iowa was prepared to pay quite a bit and did pay quite a bit for him and was going to throughout. He just had received his first major, bump from the dealership that he had the NIL deal with. But I think, Alabama maybe they're paying more. I don't think so though. I think this was more of a situation where he was kind of uncomfortable. Coming home wasn't exactly the same way that he maybe envisioned it, whether he'd come back and there'd be a parade and the prodigal son returns, and it just wasn't quite that way. He didn't receive like a great reception necessarily by a lot of the offensive linemen, but sometimes you got to work your way into that. You can't just expect to walk in the door and be the guy when they have such a veteran offensive line that you got to kind of work your way in. So I think there was just a disconnect here. Didn't work out very well, and then ultimately he decided to head back to Alabama, which I think for him would be the best move. For stay there 2 more years or whatever, and then enter the NFL draft.
Scott, I get the sense that when coaches have their frustrations about the transfer portal, they will use this as this prime example for why regulation needs to happen. I can just close my eyes and picture some sort of PowerPoint with like the Kadyn Proctor storyline playing out, and your stories are just going to be featured in there. I mean, that's probably already happening, is it not?
Yeah, it was like that exact same scenario. Like 2 days afterwards, I'm like, I can envision college leaders on Capitol Hill asking for antitrust exemptions because of Kadyn Proctor's situation. That, look, this is what happened, and this bilked people out of their money and their enjoyment here. They thought that they were going to get this NFL caliber left tackle on the line of a Tristan Wirfs from a few years ago, and instead, not even halfway through the semester, I mean, even before spring practice started, he was out the door and had already collected on some money. And it's like, this is why contracts are needed and necessary in sports. And I've talked to Kirk, not necessarily about this specifically, he really wouldn't go there, but just in general. And he kind of think, you almost got to go back to the NLI, National Letter of Intent, which is if you commit to a program and receive some sort of payment, then there needs to be some sort of contract with that. And, whether a length of time is just simply 1 season or 3 years or whatever, that probably does need to be enforced now because, a business that was trying to help out him and the Iowa football program got bilked out a lot of money and for nothing. And that's really unfortunate.
I've been saying for a while that, Kirk Ferentz is one of these coaches that when he calls it a career, it's not necessarily going to come off as a surprise, but for Iowa's perspective, it would make all the sense in the world if their first call was to Mark Stoops. I mean, given the ties as somebody who played there, somebody who has built up Kentucky basically to be the SEC's version of Iowa in so many ways. If I set the over-under at 2 more Kirk Ferentz seasons at Iowa, what would you take? And do you think Iowa's first call would be to Mark Stoops?
I would take the over by very little, like by 1. But I think so 2.5 would be a really good number on him.
Yeah.
But I do think that he would be, if not the first call, he would be in the first hour of calls, or his agent would be, because yes, absolutely, he needs to be a call. And it's really fascinating to think back to 1999 when Bob Stoops was the defensive coordinator at Florida. and his choices were Iowa and Oklahoma. And Oklahoma said, "Here's the job. You want it. You've got it." And Iowa was in a better position at that point than Oklahoma was. They were really coming off the Barry Switzer years. They were getting pounded in the Big 12 early on. Iowa, Hayden Fry had stepped away, and he was obviously a legend here. And he played for him. His dad is buried in an Iowa jersey that all three of the brothers wore, the same number 41 in Iowa. And Bob Bowlesby and the committee they weren't going to do it that way. They weren't going to just say, "Here's the job." And so it kind of became oh, okay, I got an interview for this. And then the interview didn't go real well. And he went to Oklahoma. Iowa hired Kirk Ferentz. I would argue that they were the best possible hires for both schools ultimately. And so I think Mark would be a great coach here because he understands and his recruiting prowess would get Iowa probably a little bit higher level recruit in the Ohio area. Plus, if they maintain kind of their base, which is Chicago, Iowa, Midwest, I think they would be still in a really good spot. So yes, he would be my number one call personally. And then there are a few others that I would entertain or consider. Chris Kleiman, who's an Iowa native, Lance Leipold, and then there are others. You never know who's going to rise up in the next 2 years and become the next it guy.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously Kentucky has done everything to give him a contract that, Andy Staples calls all the time. He's like, it's the best contract in college football, especially now that it's at like $9 million base pay and all the incentives and stuff like that. I did a deep dive on why SEC coaches just never get poached. And outside of Jeff Brom, really in the Big Ten doesn't really get coaches poached. The money and just this improved path to the playoff that the Big Ten and SEC have, it's just never been more beneficial to be able to coach in those conferences. And it's kind of amazing to think about the Big Ten having such little playoff success during that time in which these TV contracts boomed, and the Big Ten was obviously a great benefactor of that. But until Michigan broke through, you're kind of like, when is this championship contender going to come outside of Ohio State? My question now is, in a post-Harbaugh world for Michigan, for the Big Ten, is the Big Ten looking at two national title contenders with Oregon and Ohio State? Like, is that where we should set the bar at on a yearly basis? Not necessarily just this year, but moving forward.
I think there's a handful that are capable, but I also think that they ultimately are still behind the SEC in winning the whole race. They're going to have several good teams. They're going to have 3 to 4 playoff, participants / contenders every year, but winning the whole race, I think Michigan's going to take a step back a little bit and just naturally have to expect that. I think Washington may take a significant step back because of they lost 10 or 11 draft picks. They had more than 20 players enter the portal, close to 30 players enter the portal. And sure, they brought a lot from Arizona, but that's Arizona. So I think USC is capable of reaching that high ground. I think Oregon is capable of it. Penn State needs to. It's just been that kind of hovering team for a long time. It wins 10 games, mostly 9 games, 10 games, but never wins the big one. It has to in order to reach that level. I think Ohio State's the only real sure bet, again, just because they recruit at the highest level. And as we know, when you go through the playoff, you're going to go against elite athletes. And we're in the old BCS era, I would say an Iowa or Wisconsin or a Michigan State might have a shot in a one-game winner-take-all. But as you get these extra rounds, you're playing teams, whether it's an LSU, an Alabama, a Georgia, maybe a Florida State, and when their players don't opt out, and Clemson, other teams, Ohio State. Again, you're going to be playing these teams that if you might be able to beat one, but can you beat 3? And that's probably not the case when you're an Iowa or Wisconsin, for instance. So I think Oregon and USC have the firepower to get there, but do they have the staying power, and do they have the defense perennially to win games over and over and over? I haven't seen it in this era because they didn't do it in the playoff era. Ohio State has, and Ohio State got ripped off once or twice and not getting to the playoff. And part of that was the whole Big Ten playing 9 games. And, they went on the road. And I know the West Division is a laughing stock and a punching bag. But they went on the road, and it's a different ball game when you're going on the road in conference. Purdue had an electrifying offense. Iowa had Iowa had 6 guys who were drafted in the first 2 rounds when they went to Iowa City, and 4 of them were on offense, surprisingly enough. So, but I think Ohio State, I think Michigan, if Sharon Moore can get them back up, maybe not this year, but in future years. Penn State has to punch through, and Oregon and USC have that opportunity as well. But I still think that the SEC is much more well positioned into the future to win. Say, let's take over the next 6 years, 4 big championships, at maybe 4 plus, whereas the Big Ten might win 1 to 2.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that 100%. It feels like the Big Ten and SEC are holding all these cards for the Super League, but it's still something that, while I think is super intriguing, I can't fully get on board with it until you actually see that breakthrough of, oh, Tony Petitti, Greg Sankey are going to be willing to actually, talk about what this would look like and consider it, because you read the story in The Athletic that Stu Mandel reported on. You're like, oh, yeah, you've got these people are interested and these people are talking about it. Oh, by the way, the Big Ten and SEC aren't even willing to have these conversations yet. What's your take on the Big Ten's vantage point of this? Because it feels like, unless that money is just so ridiculously good with what the new TV contract would be, it doesn't make any sense for the Big Ten and SEC to essentially relinquish their advantage that they currently have on the future of college football.
Absolutely. I'm Stu and I maybe disagree on this topic, because I think the SEC and Big Ten are the 2 biggest brands in sports and college sports. Certainly, they've established themselves as leagues that people aspire to go to, and when they get in there, nobody wants to leave. You feel like if you're an SEC team, I mean, we've all heard the chants, Big Ten, there's a togetherness. Now, people plug their nose when Michigan won. Don't get me wrong. And I know in the SEC, if Alabama wins, that or Georgia wins, the teams aren't exactly like cheering for them. They're cheering for the league. And that's the kind of the same way they're like, woo, finally they punched through. But, oh, did it have to be Harbaugh? That was kind of the thought. But, the Big Ten's been around since 1896. And the SEC's been around since, 1932. And you're talking about institutions, and people want to be there. Do they really want to share the wealth and the prestige? A Georgia with a Wake Forest, or an Iowa with even an Iowa State? No, they want to separate themselves. They want to be who they are. And why would they want to pool everything? I just don't see it happening. I think largely there can be elements of a super league. I could see agreements reached that we no longer play anybody outside of FBS or something to that effect, which I think would be a great thing. Or, maybe a collective mandate if there's a new governance structure of playing, say, you have to play 10 power conference teams per year in regular season play. And I think that'd be a great thing across the board if that was kind of mandated, because then you could start to say, we're going to save some money on these guarantees, which have gotten out of control with some of the group of 5 teams. Instead of paying $2 million to Troy to come to Iowa or wherever, now you can say, well, we're going to play Oregon, I guess they're playing Oregon, but Kentucky or something like that. Same thing in the SEC. So I can't see that. I think I see more separation, and I just wonder what's the future of the ACC. How do they, because that seems to be really combustible right now. It wouldn't surprise me at all. And I don't, maybe I'm veering off, but if the ACC becomes kind of a split between the football teams and the non-football teams, because we've seen about 7 to 8 programs have kind of been in this, what do we do? Because Clemson and Florida State, where do they go? I don't know that there's an appetite in the Big Ten and there's an ability to get more money. And the SEC, why would you want to get Clemson if you already have South Carolina? Why would you want to get Florida State if you already have Florida? What about Miami? North Carolina is the one everybody would fight over, but maybe North Carolina wants to continue to keep those roots. So if you throw those 3 into the same league, along with NC State, Virginia Tech, Virginia, because of the history there, maybe a couple others, a Georgia Tech, and you have an 8-team league, you could probably make the same amount of money the ACC currently makes, and then position yourself better because you're playing better competition year in and year out. And that's what I kind of see is happening there. But I just cannot see the Super League scenario, especially if the House settlement that everybody can afford it.
Scott, last one for you. Most important question of the day. We'll end this with an over-under. Over-under 0.5 Bears Super Bowls with Caleb Williams and Tory Taylor.
I'm going over. I'm
That's
going
right.
over. You got to go 1.5. I'll go over because
Yep.
I
Let's
think
go.
you know the sad part is, as a lifelong Bears fan, and you certainly are too. The sad part is they have not had a starting quarterback in a Pro Bowl since 1942. I mean, in
God.
this in the Super Bowl era, they've had two Pro Bowl quarterbacks: Mitch Trubisky as an alternate and Jim McMahon in '85. I mean, then you got to go back to '63 with Billy Wade as a backup to Johnny Unitas or Bart Starr or somebody. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So yes, I'm all in on Caleb Williams, and this year they're going to be exciting, and then next year might be the year.
Let's go. Cheers
Yeah.
to that. Hopefully, we'll have future conversations wherein we can be talking about, I'll wear a Bear Super Bowl shirt. That's going to be the goal for future interviews. Scott, really, really great stuff, man. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Connor.